Vincent Mason ruled Liverpool's streets for decades, but when the Baltic Boys rose from the shadows, led by the ruthless Ghost and ambitious Kieran Lowe, everything changed. In the heart of the Baltic Triangle, a brutal turf war ignited, one that would push old loyalties to the breaking point and turn the city's cocaine trade into a deadly game of survival. This is the story of power, betrayal, and violence, where only the strongest would live to tell the tale. By 2015, Liverpool's Baltic Triangle was changing fast. What was once a forgotten industrial district, filled with empty warehouses, rusted shipping containers, and crumbling brick buildings, had started to come alive again. Artists moved into old factories, startup tech companies opened in abandoned docks, and trendy bars and food markets replaced scrapyards and auto shops. On the surface, the area was being reborn, but underneath the fresh paint and neon lights, a different kind of transformation was happening. One that would bring chaos, violence, and power struggles to the streets. A group of young men from the nearby Toxteth and Dingle areas had grown up watching the older generation of gangsters run the city's drug trade. These older bosses were respected, but they were also slow and stuck in their ways. The new generation didn't care about rules or tradition. They were bold, unpredictable, and hungry. When they saw the Baltic Triangle changing, they didn't see culture or opportunity. They saw territory. New clubs meant new customers. New residents meant fresh demand. And fewer cops in the area meant less interference. It was a perfect storm. This crew started small, selling pills and small bags of cocaine to clubgoers and party promoters. They used burner phones, encrypted messaging apps, and kept their operations lean. They weren't flashy. They didn't wear gold chains or drive expensive cars. They wore tracksuits, drove delivery vans, and blended in with the workers and students around them. But as their profits grew, so did their ambitions. By the end of 2016, they had outgrown the local street game. They wanted more than just a slice of the pie. They wanted control of the entire pipeline. That meant importing cocaine directly, cutting out middlemen, and pushing out anyone who got in their way. They started calling themselves the Baltic Boys. Not because they were proud of their neighborhood, but because they were claiming it as their own. To the public, the Baltic Triangle was a success story of regeneration. But in reality, it had become the breeding ground for a new kind of gangster. Smarter, meaner, and more dangerous than anything the city had seen before. For decades, Liverpool's drug empire had been ruled by the Mason firm, a tight-knit criminal organization that operated with old-school discipline and street-earned respect. Led by Vincent "Vinny" Mason, the firm had built its reputation through brutal efficiency and international connections. Vinny was a second-generation boss, inheriting both the operation and the code his father enforced: loyalty, silence, and slow, calculated moves. From the back alleys of Anfield to the ports of Algeciras, the Masons controlled the flow of drugs with minimal bloodshed. They didn't need chaos to prove power. Their name did that on its own. But by 2017, the Mason firm was weakening. Internal fractures were growing. The younger members didn't have the same discipline as their predecessors. Money was being skimmed, loyalties were shifting, and Vinny, now in his late 50s, had started to lose his grip. He was cautious in a world that now rewarded boldness. The streets were changing faster than he could adapt. The Baltic Boys saw this weakness. They had no history, no code, and no intention of playing by the old rules. They began slowly chipping away at Mason territory, starting with low-level dealers and working up. At first, the Masons didn't take the threat seriously. To them, these were just kids, impatient, loud, and reckless. But that underestimation would cost them. The warning came in the form of a body. One of Vinny's veteran street enforcers, an old-school soldier named Craig Devers, was found dead in a car park behind a shuttered pub. His hands had been cut off, his mouth taped shut, and a single bullet hole marked the center of his forehead. It was brutal, personal, and symbolic. Everyone knew what it meant. The Masons were being dismantled, piece by piece. Still, Vinny refused to retaliate without proof. He didn't want a war without understanding who he was fighting. That delay created space for the Baltic Boys to grow even stronger. As weeks passed, more Masons defected. Some vanished altogether. Whispers filled the underworld. Was Vinny slipping, or was he scared? The balance of power had shifted, and in the criminal world, when fear begins to outweigh respect, the end is never far behind. In early 2017, one shipment changed everything. A container arriving at the port of Liverpool from Rotterdam was flagged by customs officers after an anonymous tip-off. Hidden behind crates of frozen fish were tightly packed bundles wrapped in plastic and grease, over 300 kilos of high-purity cocaine. It was the biggest drug seizure the city had seen in more than a decade, and headlines praised the success of law enforcement. But behind the scenes, the fallout was far more explosive than anyone could have imagined. Unbeknownst to police, that container had two investors. Both the Mason firm and the Baltic Boys had independently bought into the shipment through different European contacts. They didn't realize until it was too late that they'd both been staking claims on the same product. What should have been a routine import for each crew suddenly turned into a disaster that ignited deep suspicion. Each side believed the other had tipped off authorities, either to sabotage the deal or take control of the route. Vinnie Mason, already suspicious of his weakening network, saw it as a betrayal. He assumed one of his own had flipped, or had been leaned on by the Baltic Boys. Meanwhile, the Baltic crew saw the bust as a strategic strike by the old firm, an attempt to choke their rising influence. Paranoia gripped both factions, and soon quiet threats turned into loud violence. In the months that followed, the city saw a sharp uptick in gang-related incidents. A known Mason assate's car exploded outside a chip shop in Walton. A Baltic Boys stash house was set on fire in the middle of the night, destroying £500,000 in product. Gunfire broke out at a club on Seal Street, where two men were shot in the legs in front of screaming tourists. No one claimed responsibility, but everyone knew who was involved. Police, though overwhelmed, struggled to connect the dots. There were no cooperating witnesses, no solid leads, only bodies and silence. Meanwhile, the streets buzzed with tension. The drug war wasn't just coming, it had already started, and both sides were now committed to fighting for total control, no matter the cost. As the war between the Mason firm and the Baltic Boys escalated, one name kept appearing in whispers, intelligence reports and late-night phone calls. Leon "Ghost" Garrity. Among the Baltic Boys, he was the most feared and the least seen. Ghost didn't handle street sales or flash money on social media. He worked in the background, managing threats, covering tracks and eliminating problems before they reached the surface. Even rival crews spoke his name with caution, unsure if he was a myth or a man. Ghost's reputation grew quickly. Police surveillance teams could never place him at a crime scene. He left no digital footprint, no traceable purchases, no known addresses. He used burner phones for a single call, then snapped them in half, and tossed them into the canal. When one of his own crew members was caught skimming profits, Ghost didn't confront him, he made him disappear. The man's body turned up weeks later in the woods outside St. Helens, hands bound, throat cut. A clear message: betrayal wouldn't be tolerated. But it wasn't just gang members who feared him. In late 2018, an undercover officer working a deep operation inside Liverpool's drug world vanished after texting his handler about a meeting with a Baltic Boys contact. 2 days later, his body was pulled from the River Mersey. His police badge had been sewn into his mouth. There were no fingerprints on the body, no DNA, no surveillance. Investigators quietly concluded it had to be an inside leak. Someone high up had known the cop's identity and passed it along. On the streets, no one doubted who had carried it out. Ghost wasn't just a killer. He was the enforcer of the Baltic Boys' rise. He ensured silence, controlled fear, and neutralized threats with surgical precision. Under his influence, rival dealers vanished. Witnesses recanted statements and any talk of rebellion within the crew was crushed. Even veteran criminals who had survived past wars started avoiding the Baltic Triangle altogether. While other members sought power through chaos, Ghost maintained it through terror. And the more he stayed in the shadows, the more powerful he became. In a world built on violence and secrets, Ghost had mastered both. Vinnie Mason had spent over 30 years building his empire, but by 2019 it was crumbling. His inner circle had thinned, his street-level soldiers were disappearing, and key lieutenants were switching sides. The Baltic Boys were no longer the future, they were the present, and they were pushing hard. For the first time in his criminal career, Vinnie was no longer feared, he was doubted, and in the underworld, doubt is the beginning of the end. Determined to reclaim his place, Vinnie made one last move, one that would either restore his power or destroy what was left of it. He reached out to old contacts in Spain, men he hadn't spoken to in years, using offshore accounts and old smuggling routes. He arranged for a massive shipment of uncut cocaine, 2 tons, sourced directly from Colombia, transported through West Africa, and finally into southern Spain, where trusted drivers would move it north. The plan was simple: bring the product in quietly, re-establish dominance with a single show of force, and remind everyone in Liverpool who still held the keys. But someone was watching. The shipment made it across Europe undetected, finally landing in a safe house in Speke, awaiting final distribution. Then, in the early hours of a Sunday morning, a convoy of unmarked vans arrived. The guards were overwhelmed without a shot fired. In less than 10 minutes, the entire load was gone. The men who pulled it off wore masks, moved like professionals, and left nothing behind. 3 days later, a video surfaced on social media. It showed a warehouse floor, stacked high with packages clearly marked with the Mason's signature symbol. One by one, the bricks were thrown into a fire, their flames captured from every angle. The footage ended with a close-up of a spray-painted message on the wall. "This city's not yours anymore." Vinnie never recovered. A week later, he was found hanged in his garage. The official report ruled it a suicide. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. But few believed it. On the streets it was taken as the final blow. The moment the old guard truly fell. The king was dead, and the new regime had claimed the throne. With the death of Vinnie Mason, the Baltic Boys moved fast to seize what was left behind. They took over distribution lines, bought out or forced out remaining loyalists, and absorbed the last of the Mason street networks. Within months, they had full control of Liverpool's cocaine trade, from the ports to the party scene. But as their influence grew, so did the attention. Rival crews from outside the city, especially from Manchester, the crew had to evolve. That evolution came through technology, and with it, a new kind of drug empire began to take shape. By 2021, the Baltic Boys had transformed their operation into something almost unrecognizable from their early days. Cash was no longer king. Instead, they shifted to cryptocurrency, using digital wallets and blockchain transactions to move millions without leaving a trace. Laundering became easier and harder to detect. They created fake tech startups, hired coders from overseas, and funneled dirty money through seemingly legitimate digital businesses. On the surface, they were entrepreneurs. Underneath, they were still drug lords. Cocaine was still the product, but the method of distribution had changed. Instead of street corners, they used encrypted apps and dark web marketplaces. Customers placed orders like takeaway food, paid in crypto, and received deliveries by fake couriers on mopeds or in rideshare cars. Drones were even tested in some areas to drop packages in parks or gardens. The entire operation became faster, harder to trace, and far more lucrative. To avoid surveillance, the Baltic Boys outsourced more work to people with no criminal records. University students, part-time gig workers and social media influencers unknowingly played roles in the chain, some moving product, others laundering money or spreading coded messages through seemingly innocent posts. Police couldn't keep up. Traditional surveillance methods, taps, stakeouts, wire jobs, no longer worked. There were no corner dealers to arrest, no meetings to intercept. Everything happened online or through tightly controlled delivery networks, and the few who did get caught knew nothing about the wider structure. Within just a year, the Baltic Boys' income more than doubled. They were making over 25 million generally, all while staying largely out of sight. On the surface, the crew looked quieter, even respectable. But in truth, they were more powerful than ever before. The violence hadn't stopped. It had just gone underground, masked by firewalls and financial smokescreens. What eventually cracked the empire wasn't a major police operation or a rival gang, it was betrayal from within. In 2022, one of the Baltic Boys' most trusted lieutenants, Jordan Firth, vanished overnight. He was known as calm, calculating, and fiercely loyal. He handled logistics for the crew's largest imports and had access to sensitive data, shipping schedules, crypto wallets, supplier names, and safe house locations. When he failed to show up to a planned drop in Garston, alarm bells rang. At first, the crew suspected he'd been killed or kidnapped. But a week later, news broke that changed everything. Jordan had resurfaced in the Netherlands, under the protection of Dutch authorities. He'd walked into a police station in The Hague, and offered full cooperation in exchange for safety and a clean record. His reason wasn't honor, guilt, or fear of prison. It was fear of ghost. Unknown to most, Jordan had been quietly stealing from the organization for over a year, skimming large amounts of crypto and rerouting cash through fake shell companies. Someone inside the crew had found out, and word had reached Ghost. Facing certain death, Jordan made the only move he could: run and talk. What he handed over was devastating. Hard drives full of encrypted messages, transaction logs, shipping manifests, even audio recordings of conversations with high-level members. For the first time, law enforcement had a clear window into how the Baltic Boys operated. They had names, faces, timelines, and evidence enough to connect the crew to multiple murders, drug shipments, and money laundering networks across Europe. Jordan's betrayal sent shockwaves through the organization. Trust dissolved overnight. Members started accusing each other of talking, of leaking, of plotting. Paranoia spread like wildfire. Some went into hiding, others fled the country, a few vanished entirely, suspected to have been quietly removed by those still loyal to the core. Ghost, meanwhile, disappeared. No calls, no sightings, nothing. It was as if he'd been erased. Some believed he killed Jordan before the authorities could use him. Others thought he was preparing for something bigger. The cracks were now too wide to ignore. For the first time, the empire wasn't just under threat, it was beginning to collapse from the inside. The moment Jordan Firth's evidence reached British authorities, a silent but massive operation went into motion. Codenamed Operation Crimson Tide, it was the largest organized crime crackdown Liverpool had seen in decades. Over 18 months of intelligence was compiled into a single coordinated assault. Surveillance teams worked around the clock. Warrants were signed, tactical units were mobilized. The Baltic Boys, once thought untouchable, were about to face a storm they hadn't anticipated. At dawn on a cold February morning in 2023, raids began simultaneously across Liverpool, Manchester, even as far as Marbella and Amsterdam. Police battered down doors in the Baltic Triangle, flooded safe houses, and seized encrypted devices, cash, and drugs. Over 70 individuals were arrested in less than 24 hours. Among them were lieutenants, couriers, tech specialists, and accountants who had propped up the empire. Storage units filled with cocaine, ketamine, and MDMA were uncovered. Luxury cars, designer clothes, offshore account details, and millions in cryptocurrency were all seized. But not everyone was caught. Key figures were already gone by the time the raids started. Some vanished weeks earlier, tipped off by whispers from corrupt insiders. Others simply disappeared without a trace. The biggest mystery was Ghost. No one knew where he was. His phones were dead, his bank accounts empty. Multiple sightings poured in, from a villa in Dubai, a resort in Marbella, even a back alley in Naples, but none could be verified. Some believed he had been killed and buried to cover tracks. Others were convinced he was still pulling strings from the shadows. Despite the success of the operation, Police knew they hadn't captured the full network. Parts of the operation had fractured and scattered. Smaller cells re-emerged in nearby cities. New names were rising. The arrest wave had slowed the flow, but it hadn't stopped it. The streets felt the impact. Violence dipped, and the flash of gang culture dimmed for a time. But beneath the calm, a dangerous truth remained. Empires fall, but the demand never dies. And in Liverpool, where crime runs deep in the blood of the city, silence is only ever temporary. The storm had passed, but the clouds still lingered. Years after Operation Crimson Tide shook Liverpool, the city's underworld was far from quiet. The Baltic Boys had been fractured, their leaders scattered, but their legacy remained. New groups, inspired by their rise and fall, began to carve out their own territories. Some adopting the same ruthless tactics, others evolving with the times in new and unexpected ways. The Baltic Triangle itself had transformed once more. The flashy clubs and renovated warehouses were now a front for a more complex criminal ecosystem. While cocaine still flowed, newer markets emerged. Synthetic drugs, human trafficking, cybercrime, and money laundering through digital currencies. The street wars were replaced by quiet power struggles fought in boardrooms, chat rooms, and encrypted servers. Ghost, the elusive enforcer who had disappeared, became a legend in Liverpool's criminal history. Rumors persisted that he had reinvented himself in another country, running operations from afar or training a new generation of criminals. Some said he had died in exile. Others believed he was waiting for the right moment to return. Whatever the truth, his shadow loomed large over the city's gangland, a reminder of how fear and control could shape entire communities. Law enforcement agencies had improved their tactics, learning from past mistakes. Cyber units grew stronger, intelligence sharing increased across borders, and community programs aimed to stop young people from being drawn into gangs. Yet the fight was ongoing and far from over. The Baltic Boys' story was now a warning, a case study in how power, greed, and violence could rise from the ashes of change. For many in Liverpool, the Baltic Boys were more than just criminals. They were a symbol of a city grappling with rapid transformation and the dark consequences that come with it. The old world had died, but the new one was still dangerous, unpredictable, and hungry for control. The Baltic Triangle remained a place of contrasts, hope and fear, progress and decay, ambition and destruction. And as long as those forces existed, the cycle of turf wars and cocaine kings would continue. The city would keep changing, but the story of its streets would never truly end.